What's up, gamers? Welcome back to 180 MTG. My name is Ryan Overturf, and today continues Spooky Month here on the podcast, continuing to explore my Spooky Cube. 2 weeks ago, I introduced the cube, talked a little bit about the history and the design inspirations and influence, a lot of focus on original Innistrad there. Last week, I talked about the modular nature of the cube, just kind of talked about modular cubes broadly, but also kind of emphasize what's going on with this design here, where I have two 180 card cubes that are individual modules that you can shuffle together for a 360 card play experience. And this week and next week, I'm going to look at those individual modules and how they function as their own 180 card cubes. Something I highlighted last week was how it's really important to me for these kind of modular environments to focus on creating individually fun play experiences. That way, when you shuffle them together, you at least know you have two things that work, and you can kind of mess with things from there if they don't seem to work when you shuffle them together. But as long as you are kind of looking at the cube when you take kind of general design principles, something that I'm sure I'm going to do an episode on in the future, but something just to keep in mind anytime you're working on a cube mana curve, just a general power level, as long as you're kind of drawing within the lines on your different modules and things are kind of similar in that regard, they should play at least fine. And I talked last week about how you really could just shuffle any 280 card cubes together for a 360 card cube, or just different numbers. I guess you could shuffle two 360 card cubes together for a 720 if you wanted to play like 12 players or 16 players or something like that, whatever you want to do. But for the purpose of my designs, my experience, and for this cube, the Spooky Cube, and the Human module and the Monster module, those are the numbers I'm talking about. 180 card cubes that shuffle together for one 360 card environment. So today I'm talking about the Human module. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview about what this cube is, what it's about, and then break things down by color, highlighting both what makes this environment fun, what makes this environment tick, and also kind of some splits, cards that are in one module over the other. A reminder that the 360 card Spooky Cube is a singleton environment. So if a card is in the Human module, it is not in the Monster module, and vice versa. So let's go ahead and get down to it and talk about what's here, what's not here, and how this whole thing works. I will have the Cube Cobra page for the Human module in the show notes here so you can follow along as I kind of go by color and by card. But first, just the overview of the environment. The Human module is a cube that really highlights human typal. Human matters as a creature type, both in terms of cards are going to say something about when you cast a human, humans you control, that sort of thing. So human typal is a theme here. And overwhelmingly, the creatures in the Human module are humans. It's in fact very rare that you will control a non-human creature in this cube. Creatures that aren't printed as humans tend to be clones, or cards like Metallic Mimic, where once they enter the battlefield, they will become humans. And then kind of the exception to this is Croaking Counterpart, which makes a copy of something except it's a frog. So that one's a little bit weird as far as the clone space goes. It's something that might not stick around in the cube forever, but it's nice to have, at least in the 360 card environment, where it's a card that plays out of the graveyard. Flashback is just really nice in this cube. So I have it in the Human module. Even though it's maybe a little funky, it's strange to clone your Thalia's Lieutenant and then the new one is not a human, but it still pumps your other humans and it still grows when you make humans. So it's a little funky, but it's an Innistrad card. It plays out of the graveyard, and this is the side of the cube that's going to have more emphasis on clones. Clones are something that I think play really well when it comes to typal strategies, just because you only have so many real payoffs. You know, there's only so many Thalia's Lieutenant. You're going to hear me name that card a bunch because there's only so many of that effect. You know, Mayor of Averbrook, there's just a few of them that really pay you off. And so the clones can really turn up the heat on those synergies. There was a while where I also had Zombies matter in Spooky Cube when it was just a 360 card cube. Humans and zombies were both things. So when you have multiple creature types matter, a clone can play in either deck. So that's when I really started to explore clones as a significant part of the environment. I like them a lot, even as I peeled back on zombies. And they also just play really well for any kind of creature-based payoff. I really like clones as far as a modest but powerful contextually thing for blue to do that's not just countering your spells, taking extra turns, drawing extra cards. So blue stuff that is powerful and appealing but takes a little bit of setup and a little bit of work. Love that, and clones are the good fit for this environment. And with humans mattering and being the big thing that this cube is about, the gameplay then is naturally on the battlefield. The gameplay in the human module is about developing creatures and trying to get good attacks, trying to break up your opponent's synergies, trying to prevent your opponent from having good attacks. So a lot of this is just casting creatures, having some amount of removal or disruption for your opponent's creatures, and navigating your battlefield development relative to your opponents and engaging in combat. That makeup, where basically every creature in this cube is a human, does give this cube some context that's really different from any kind of Magic limited environment. Certainly if you're talking about retail limited, even when it comes to typal sets, even if there's like 5 supported creature types, it's still the case there's a lot of creatures in those environments that just aren't any of those creature types. Any retail limited set, they serve a lot of masters. There's a lot of reasons where a card shows up in those environments. It's also engaging in a way to value cards higher if they're one creature type or another, where Spooky Cube is kind of taking this more from almost a constructed standpoint, where it says, yeah, you're building a human deck. Of course you're only going to want to select humans. All of these creatures are human, so knock yourself out. Go nuts. And this is a significant departure from when I was just maintaining the one 360 card Spooky Cube, because that cube, like I said, there used to be zombie typal, but then there's also just a lot of creatures, if you look at the monster module, that aren't humans, that just aren't going to synergize with these things. It was an avenue to explore, but it wasn't something that you were doing just kind of by default. So that recontextualization, that's something that really makes the human module stand out as a very unique environment. You're playing creatures on the battlefield, things are about combat, in a lot of ways it's kind of a combat cube, a little bit more of an attrition environment where you're using one for removal and not as much pump spells that you would often see in a cube that was more explicitly about combat. But that aspect where you just know all the creatures are human, and importantly, it's not an emblem cube. You don't just have to think about things that are external to the cards. You read the cards, they're going to say human on the type line, and some of them are going to say that humans matter in the game. And that's something that you really don't get, certainly in other limited environments. You get little tastes of it, you get some creature synergies, but this is a cube where you are doing the thing, whether you like it or not, in every draft. I mean, if you're going to play this cube, I certainly would hope that you like it. And this is something that's gone over really well with everybody that I've played this cube with, because it is true that all your creatures are humans and there's going to be some payoff for human as creature type mattering, but not every deck is going to explicitly call that out. Kind of what I was saying, there's only one Thalia's Lieutenant as a card, there's only one Mayor of Averbrook. There's things that are going to really matter for human, but outside of that, you have sacrifice decks, you have spells matter decks, you have some mechanical stuff that's looting or rummaging, you have threshold appearing in a little bit, you start to get a little bit of graveyard matter stuff going on. In some of the games, human won't really matter as a creature type, so it's this thing that if you want to really go down that road and you want to have Champion of the Parish and have that card be an ace, have that card be the best 1-mana creature in your deck, or maybe just outright the best creature in your deck, you are empowered and enabled to do that. But even if I just put this cube in front of some people and said, hey, here's 4 players, draft, this is a play on the battlefield, combat-centric environment, some of them might piece it together and some of them might not. I'm willing to bet that at the end of that draft, at least one person is probably like, oh, there's a lot of human matter as, hey, every creature is a human. But somebody might just be taking like Snapcaster Mage, Counterspell, Fatal Push, and you might tell them at the end of the draft, hey, what did you think of that humans cube? And they would have this light bulb moment like, oh, yeah, everything was just humans, huh? And you don't have to be totally clueless to miss that the human thing is really heavy-handed in this environment. You might have a really nice sacrifice deck that's just powerful sacrifice synergies. It just happens that you have Zulaport Cutthroat because it's a human instead of Blood Artist because it's a vampire, and there's still powerful stuff going on. You can still just draft a deck that's a selection of threats, interaction, and mana fixing that you think is a reasonable deck, and you'll have a good chance to be competitive here. So there is a theme here that is really heavily enforced in the design, but it's not beating you over the head in the play experience, which I think is really cool and has been received very well. So now let's start to break the cube down by color, starting with white. You remember that white is really the color that is the reason for humans matter being a thing that you would want to incorporate in a graveyard cube. This was, of course, an aspect of original Innistrad, and every subsequent Innistrad visit has done some humans matter. And there's the aesthetic aspect, but it's also just a mechanical thing. If you ever worked on a graveyard cube, white is just the problem color. It does the least things with the graveyard. I have known multiple people that have done graveyard cubes that just color restrict it. They say, I'm not doing any white cards. We're doing blue, black, red, green. And that's how we're playing with the graveyard, only with stuff that's really explicitly about filling the graveyard and using the graveyard as a resource. So if you want to do all 5 colors, you kind of have to get a little fancy. And it was a little bit harder to do white for the monster module than the human module. It's not that difficult to go up and down and get a bunch of humans to fill out a curve, and you get a lot of really nice Humans Matters cards, that Thalia's Lieutenant, that Champion of the Parish. You get creatures that pump out human tokens, like Thraben Doomsayer, that are really nice. The hard part is really just saving enough humans that you have enough playable cards on the graveyard-centered side of things. So the monster module is really just reserving some number of the individually powerful humans that don't explicitly care about those human synergies. I mentioned last week how Thraben Inspector and Novice Inspector end up in the monster module just because they're cards you would more realistically play in a deck that's not just about humans. They're just good on rate. They're going to play really well in any kind of sacrifice deck. And so I wanted to have the human module then just be humans that are really just trying to do this play on the battlefield thing and save things with more unique effects, with more value generating effects, and kind of a gameplay agnostic way for the monster module. So then cards like Luminarch Aspirant really make sense in the human module because it really is a card that cares about combat and not just generic value. So the human module is a lot more about just attacking and blocking and playing things face up on the battlefield. Luminarch Aspirant wouldn't be as strong as a standalone card in the monster module, where drawing an extra card that's always going to be strong, but extra power and toughness. This environment, the human module is way more about that. Luminarch Aspirant looks very natural next to Thalia's Lieutenant, very natural next to Aileen, Resplendent Cathar, just these kind of aggressive creatures that are trying to help you curve out and play a good aggressive deck. That's a lot of what white is about in this environment. And then there's some stuff that does both play with the graveyard and acknowledge the graveyard aspects of the cube. Cemetery Protector is kind of a loud example of that in white, where I have some very light graveyard hate peppered into the cube. I don't want you to be able to play a controlling deck that just hoses your opponent's graveyard synergies, but I also don't want you just to be dead if your opponent is going to overwhelm you when they flashback spider spawning. I want a little bit going on here. So Cemetery Protector can exile a card from the graveyard, but if you're just playing the human module, it's a human, it makes human tokens, so it's very natural here, and then it gets to be recontextualized and gains some additional points when you draft the full 360 card environment. Another fun piece of graveyard interaction is Veteran Survivor. I added a handful of cards from Duskmourn that have this Survivor mechanic. If you're not familiar, these abilities are all things that trigger in your second main phase if the creature is tapped. So basically, if the creature is tapped after combat, the easiest way to do that is to just attack with the creature. But this is an environment where everybody is going to be playing to the battlefield. The curve is pretty lean, a lot of cheap creatures, it can be tough to get an attack through. Something I did to supplement survival as a supported mechanic, even if it's only on a handful of cards, is to have a good amount of Convoke here. That is what I determined to be the most fun and appealing way to just tap a creature without attacking. You could do vehicles, but cards like Smuggler's Copter, they're just really strong, and somebody else is going to get them. It's not really a synergy piece when it's that powerful, so having something that plays really well explicitly with wanting to tap your creature without being broadly appealing necessarily. Something a little bit more subtle, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So I have Conclave Tribunal, of course, Knight Errant of Eos, and I spread into other colors. I just tried to get as much of this stuff that was appealing and powerful. In black, you have a couple removal spells, Collective Nightmare, Lethal Scheme. I even dusted off a copy of Stoke the Flames in red, which I am really happy to be keeping with that card. That card saw a ton of constructed play in like 2015 and has just kind of disappeared since then. So it's been nice to have that interaction. And again, kind of like humans and humans battering in this cube, that's a synergy that you can have access to, but it's not something loudly that you have to do. These cards do just play, and then you can find these ways to make those synergies and to get more value out of the cards as well. And notably, Veteran Survivor, exiling cards from graveyards, that matters a lot more than when you go into the 360 card environment. So it's just something that comes up, can be useful here in the human module, and then is also kind of a plant for the full Spooky Cube experience. And then one last thing to call out in white, this is going to be the first example of where maintaining Singleton in the full 360 card environment starts to create some tension in the individual module designs. I know that I want to have Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares in the full Spooky Cube, but I also know that both of the individual modules are going to want some kind of interaction. I talked a bit on the first episode about Spooky Cube about how exiling removal is pretty important to me. I don't want that much graveyard interaction, but exiling creatures on the battlefield that can be meaningful, both in terms of just interacting with what might be pressuring you in play, but also exiling instead of destroying means that you could be answering something that could have mattered in the graveyard later, either explicitly as an individual card that will recur itself, like a Bloodghast kind of thing, or a piece of the volume for a spider spawning kind of effect. So I know I want Swords of Plowshares, and I know I want Path to Exile, and it's probably true that both of these cubes will be pretty happy having both of those cards. It just kind of made sense to me to split this where one cube got swords and the other got path, but how did I want to do it? And where I landed was actually kind of opposite that humans breakdown, where I put the more game state agnostic humans in the monster module. I took the more powerful card, Swords to Plowshares, and I put it in the human module, because just exiling is more likely to matter in the monster module. So your removal spell having a bit of a drawback, that's going to be less significant, at least in terms of you probably cared more about the exiling itself. And also there's so much more going on in terms of synergy, where with the human module, the games are a lot about curving out, and the drawback of letting your opponent search their deck for a basic land and putting on the battlefield, ramping them. If you have to Path to Exile a 3-drop on turn 3, for example, you want to answer Tireless Tracker immediately. If you Path to Exile that on 3, suddenly your opponent is likely to have 5 mana on the following turn. They can really just run away with just that extra mana value far more easily in this cube that is just about playing to the battlefield than in the monster module, where their synergy is going to more often enable players to do more with less. So I broke that down. It's kind of interesting to me the way that the more powerful humans go in the monster module, but then the more powerful removal goes into the human module, just because the exiling matters or the human matters in a certain way. So I think that stuff is really cool. I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and it's fun for me. And I want to reiterate something that I said last week about how these modular cubes, they certainly don't have to be singleton from module to module. You certainly could just put Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile on both cubes. If you're talking about drawbacks in a card, I guess you can just have 2 swords and no paths, whatever you want to do, but that's how I approached it for the purpose of my design. And that brings us to blue. I've already talked a bit about how clones are a pretty significant aspect of this design. You do have multiple clones just in mono blue. And then something else going on here is With blue, in the full Spooky Cube, when it was just a 360 card cube, blue is one of the colors that just naturally fits into the discard Matters archetype. That's where you're going to see a lot of Madness support. And something that's important about making Madness work and making it appealing and making players want to draft it, Madness is reliant on discarding cards for value. And if you want that to be appealing, you kind of have to limit the generic card advantage in the environment. If you can just draw extra cards without discarding any and just cast your spells, that's at least easier to approach than Madness if it's not outright more powerful. Even in the situations where drawing and discarding, if you're able to Madness a Fiery Temper and kill a creature and get some discount on your mana that way, if somebody else is just casting Divination and Lightning Bolt, you have to be going at least a full turn faster in what you're doing to be ahead on that exchange with the Madness deck. You're just jumping through more hoops. I don't know why anybody would draft the Madness deck over just the card advantage, do whatever you want, Cryptic Command deck if both were options. And even when the Madness deck is performing better, it does kind of rely on drawing the right cards in the right order, which a generic control deck really doesn't. So in designing blue for the human module, I did need to add some stuff because the best Madness cards, those are going to go into the monster module. It's going to be way more explicitly supported there. I do have a few discard outlets here, but I have some slots to flesh out, and I really wanted to make sure I was adding cards that were appealing in terms of playing a blue deck in the humans module that didn't just overshadow and make the synergies in the monster module not appealing. I talked last week about how the human module gets this more generic spells matter archetype and how that can play really well with Madness. And the important thing about making that tick is I wanted to generally have cards that only replace themselves. I didn't want you to get those really big haymakers like the Cryptic Command type cards. I didn't want you to easily get 2-for-1s here. And so what I have here is a lot of just kind of basic building blocks for the cards you see in a lot of cubes. Ponder, Preordain, Consider is nice because that does gain some value when you go into the full graveyard environment. And I added a small selection of counter spells. That was something that was useful to give blue an identity. They're cards that are powerful and appealing, but given that the cube is so much about curving out, it can be difficult. You do have to navigate your position. You do have to find a way to be ahead on the battlefield, or at least stop yourself from falling behind to really leverage a counterspell. Cards like Mana Leak, Counterspell, they are really high picks in a lot of cubes, and they are useful here if you are able to navigate the control lane and really figure out how to stop your opponent from overpowering you on the battlefield. But they're not just going to be hammers that you'll win the game very easily by casting them. So getting some strength here in blue in counterspells was a really good solution to this environment, where the 360 card Spooky Cube originally really just had a couple counterspells. There was Circular Logic, because that's a Madness card, and I think I maybe had 1 or 2 gold options. But then these cheap, strong blue counterspells show up here because they play reasonably in an environment that's just about playing onto the battlefield while not making the cube about something else. So that was a really good way to kind of flesh out blue here. And it highlights something that you're probably going to have to do if you want to take a larger cube and break it into more smaller environments. You probably can't just do a schoolyard pick kind of thing and just break it into 2 cubes with the cards you already have. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but for my sensibilities, for actually really nourishing the individual play environments, I did find that they played better and they made more sense to me and looked nicer on paper if I did make some cuts and some edits to add some things that maybe weren't previously present in the larger environment, to allow these new, smaller environments to have more of their own identity, so they have their own new context, and then you get to have that recontextualization when you do shuffle the environments together. And that brings us to black. Black has kind of been the historically most represented color in Spooky Cube in practice. And I don't mean there's any kind of color imbalance. There's not more black cards, but just kind of by nature of being a graveyard environment, I would notice that in drafts it would be fairly common for about half of the table to at least be splashing black. There's usually at least something kind of appealing for your deck in black. And it makes sense then that breaking black into the two components for the human module and the monster module, black required the least edits. It was the easiest to be like, all right, these cards go over here, these cards over here. And the breakdown, a lot of it was as simple as humans in the human module, monsters in the monster module. That's actually so extreme, I don't really have exiling removal in black. I have a lot of 1-for-1 removal on the battlefield, and so just having the efficient stuff like Fatal Push makes a lot of sense if you're concerned about being run over by Champion of the Parish. And then stuff that has other synergies, be it a card with Madness like Dark Withering, a card with relevant types like Deadweight to support Delirium, a discard outlet itself like Collective Brutality, that more easily slots into the monster module. So black is fairly basic here in the human module. You have some spot removal spells, you do have some of those nice convoke spells that do have some synergies with the survivors. Black does have a survivor itself in the Cynical Loner, which if it triggers its survival ability gets to entomb every turn in your second main phase, which doesn't do a ton in the human module. There's some flashback stuff, there's some stuff that plays out of the graveyard, but that's something that's going to be way more meaningful in the 360 card experience. So again, that contextualization, that recontextualization aspect of the modular cube experience that I find very cool. And then there is one card in black that was actually really interesting in terms of where to put it and how it's going to play. And it might not be the one that you would guess. It is Mogis's Marauder, which is 2 and a black for a 2/2 human berserker. And when it enters, up to X target creatures gain Intimidate and Haste until end of turn, where X is your devotion to black. The reason that this card is in Spooky Cube is for the Rally the Ancestors combo deck. This is a explicit nod to the old Rally the Ancestors constructed deck. So Rally the Ancestors is white, white, X. It's an instant. Return all creatures from your graveyard with mana value X or less to the battlefield. Exile them at the beginning of your next upkeep. So the difficult aspect of Rally the Ancestors is you can get all these creatures from your graveyard to the battlefield, but you'll never be able to attack with them. There's some ways to go off in this cube, a sacrifice outlet and some number of blood artist effects, so you can just sacrifice your board and drain your opponent's life that way. Or Mogis's Marauder is a big one because it would actually give the creatures haste, so you just rally the ancestors on your turn, your first main phase, give them haste and attack. So Mogis's Marauder is really just in the full cube to facilitate that kind of deck, but it can play. If you just put Mogis's Marauder in your sacrifice deck, you have some pretty strong threats to curve out with. Tenacious Underdog and Umbral Collar Zealot, those are just 2 mana creatures with 3 power. Just getting those hits in that can make it easier to close with your Blood Artist effects later, or it's just a good aggressive card. So then you can contextualize Mogis's Marauder in the human module. This is an evasive creature that can allow you to get a big hit on the battlefield against non-black decks. It can just make multiple creatures unblockable, and then you shuffle the 2 modules together, and now you have unlocked Mogis's Marauder as a combo piece in the Rally the Ancestors deck. So that recontextualization, that's something that I find very cool. And then black is also going to give 2 really strong sacrifice payoffs in the human module. You have Zethrid Necromancer and Jaren Corrupted Bishop. These are both creatures that make creature tokens whenever a human you control dies, and every creature you control is just going to be a human here. So these are really strong payoffs for a sacrifice deck. They can also just give you good attacks because it becomes less appealing to block when all your stuff just replaces itself. So there's going to be premium targets, certainly for spot removal, for exiling removal, for counter spells, and those are kind of fun to think about in the modular environment as well. where they are going to become less consistently powerful in the 360 card environment when you introduce a lot more non-human creatures. So that's a cool aspect of the modular design here as well, where you have these cards that really shine because every creature does key off of their ability, but then that changes as you recontextualize things into the larger cube design. So that's a fun aspect here as well. And that brings us to red. Red actually is kind of tonally similar to white in the human module, where you see a lot of cards that are just generally reasonable to have in a cube. You have some prowess threats, Monastery Swiftspear, Soulscar Mage, just stuff that doesn't require that much to get you going. There are also humans. Grim Lavamancer is a human that does use the graveyard, but it's like the kind of thing that doesn't really play great in a graveyard deck because typically a graveyard deck cares about maintaining those resources. So that tension is kind of fun. You get a little bit of discard matters here. I talked about that last week where I have the Electro's Bolt here, really teasing the madness theme of the monster module and the 360 card Spooky Cube draft experience, along with cards like Alesha Who Smiles at Death and Sabin Master Monk that have some stuff going on with the graveyard. Alesha can reanimate smaller creatures, Sabin can blitz out of your graveyard by discarding a card. Mostly, these are just good bodies. 3/2 first strike, 4/3 double strike. Those are really strong creatures. Like, contextually, those bodies are going to be able to engage in combat very effectively in an environment like this. But then there's the seeds of the graveyard mattering later. A really cool card in red is Kessig Malcontents. 2 in a red for a 3/1. When it enters, it deals damage equal to the number of humans you control to target player. That's just a fun one to clone. You can really go off in that way. And that's another card similar to Mogi's Marauder, where if you're doing like a Rally the Ancestors thing, if you have a high volume of humans for that archetype, the Kessig Malcontents can just enter and just dome your opponent for a ton of damage and end the game. So it's kind of a combo piece. It's kind of just a strong card to curve out on in your humans matter deck. Maybe you have a different 3 drops. You just develop your battlefield, get some hits in, and you sandbag that one to be a lava axe at the end of things. Really fun card. I love cubing with it. And similar to blue, you get some generic spells matter stuff. I talked about the prowess threats. You have Young Pyromancer, some burn spells. You have just 1-for-1 removal. Nothing that exiles here, but some stuff that does give you some reach. Fork Bolt, Chain Lightning Bolt, Stoke the Flames that can just end the game outside of combat, adding that texture to the environment. And then something that is pretty cool in terms of a split between Spooky versus Monster module. A lot of what's happening here, the red creatures, they are just the humans. The ones in the monster module are just the non-humans. But there is a split here where there's 2 2-mana humans that really care about discarding. And I split them, one in this cube, one in the other. That's Inti, Seneschal of the Sun versus Conspiracy Theorist. Inti makes it into the human module because it's just more of a generic creature playing on the battlefield. It is a discard outlet, but it just gives you something back right away. Gives a creature trample, gives a +1/+1 counter, replaces that card. Where Conspiracy Theorist is something that has more layered synergies with discard matter decks. Conspiracy Theorist always gives you access to cards that you discard for any reason, so it's more of a loud synergy piece. It would play here in the human module, but Inti is more loudly a card that can just go into any creature deck, that's going to play really well in an aggressive deck, and then does turn up the heat on those synergies in the full cube environment. Notably, Inti also has independent clauses where it always exiles the top card of your deck whenever you discard for any reason, but that's less the synergy in the fully tuned Madness decks. It's more a card that's just better for curving out. I think people talk about Inti as an interesting or powerful synergy piece a lot. They put it in like Reanimator decks. Typically, I don't like it there. I like Inti a lot as an aggressive card, and it gives you some value, and sometimes you can discard a card and get something good for it. But it's way more of a raw rate card for my money, and that's why it just makes more sense to me in this ABC creature combat driven environment. It's just easier to put it in a deck where all you care about is making good attacks, and that's why it's going to shine here, and Conspiracy Theorist is going to be in the environment that's more explicitly about those discard synergies. And that brings us to green, which has the most creatures of any color. 20 of the 23 green cards are just creatures, they are just humans, but you do get a pretty good sampling of things that are teasing the broader graveyard themes. You have Rubble Belt Maverick as a 1 mana 1 1 that surveils and it does something out of the graveyard. You have Town Greeter, which is just a good value card. You mill your top 4 cards when it enters, and you can put a land from above them into your hand, so that's Satyr Wayfinder kind of thing, but this one's a human. Just a nice card for curving out and generating value, but then gets stronger once you actually really care about the graveyard and the full cube environment. Werebear, which you might not know if you've only ever seen an Odyssey copy, is a human. It's just a bear in the art, but Werebear is a human. It also synergizes here with Town Greeter. Having Threshold means it does care about the graveyard, but it's not as loudly as about the graveyard as stuff in the monster module. Stuff like Eternal Witness and Savvy Trader and Timeless Witness. Just a lot of graveyard recursion, but cards that just play in normal games. So great spread here. You have humans matter stuff like Mayor of Averbrook. You have some cheap humans that generate mana like Avacyn's Pilgrim and Noble Hierarch. So green has this identity where you have this mana generation. You tease a lot of the graveyard and graveyard recursion. Town Greeter just milling for value and hitting something nice for your Eternal Witness. That's a cool synergy you can latch onto in just the human environment. And then that's the kind of thing that gets turned up to 11 in the full 360 card Spooky Cube environment. Non-creature spells were a little tough in green. When I was curating just the 360 card cube, a lot of what was happening in green was any non-creature was there to fill up your graveyard, was there to be a meaningful contributor to delirium, instants and sorceries that, both you cast them, they go to your graveyard, but then ideally they give you more stuff in your graveyard, Malevolent Rumble being a great example of that. But then in the human module, because it's less explicitly about the graveyard, and because I made this side of the cube way more about playing on the battlefield, I went just with some tried and true stuff that didn't really make sense in the previous 360 card Spooky Cube. Some protection spells, Blossoming Defense, Snakeskin Veil to make getting into combat, having kind of a pump spell, or just a way to shake off a removal spell being meaningful there. And then Inscription of Abundance, which does some of that as well, or as a fight spell. So again, just cards that really play onto the battlefield. So green is kind of wildly different between the human module and the monster module. But then you have this high volume of creatures. This is stuff that's all really going to play in a spider spawning deck. Of course, you do just need a volume of creatures. You have some discard outlets. You're never going to be too upset to have a 1 mana dork. And so this stuff does matter more in that graveyard environment. And then the things that already did synergize with the graveyard are going to become even more impactful in the full 360 card cube. Moving on to gold cards and colorless cards, there's nothing too fancy or significant here. You have more humans, you have more aspects for the synergies of this environment that's going to be sacrifice things, outlets and payoffs, a little bit of discard matters, a little bit of humans matter, a little bit of spells matter. Kind of a funny card is Metallic Mimic as one of my colorless cards. Actually, just the only colorless spell in the human module. 2 mana 2/1. When it enters, you choose a creature type. It becomes that type, and then additional creatures you enter of that type enter with an additional +1/+1 counter. So sort of a human lord. Another one of those cards that in ways gets weaker in the full 360 card cube. There's some different creature types you can name there. Like, it's not a non-starter to name spider for spider spawning, to name zombie for some of the zombie stuff going on. There's a number of token makers where you can do something different with it. And then it also does have multiple types. Being an artifact and a creature means it can be an aspect of delirium. Naming spider for Ishkana Grafwedo, that can come up, that can be real. It's a lot of power and toughness when you add those pieces together, even if spider is a weird name outside of a small sampling of cards. I also just count Dismember and Gitaxian Probe in the colorless column. because you will just play these in any deck. Gitaxian Probe, it's more of a blue and a red card, but you're not unhappy to have it when you're deciding how you want to curve out as your green-white deck against somebody that could have removal spells when you're choosing between your human lords or your synergy pieces versus just casting some creature. And Dismember, of course, that one more cleanly always goes in any deck. It tends to be more meaningful and stronger, for example, in a green deck, just having a piece of removal in a color that does not get very much of that. And Dismember also very loudly, if you know what this cube is about, you know your opponent's going to be casting human creatures, so a removal spell goes in any deck, so makes a lot of sense as a colorless option here. And that just leaves lands. I definitely wanted fetch lands in the monster module, which in a way made this breakdown pretty easy. Even easier once Travail lands were printed. Now I just have 3 cycles of great 2-color lands. I have shock lands, fast lands, and original dual lands, plus a Prismatic Vista and a Fabled Passage. There's a couple things that care about both lands going to your graveyard landfall or just cards in graveyards like Grim Lavamancer, Tireless Tracker. They gain some value with those kind of fetch lands in the spread here. They make the mana a little bit better. Those 5-color lands that are a little bit more generic, that don't require a full cycle as opposed to needing 10 fetch lands, they made sense to put here because this cube, because the fetch lands are in the monster module, this cube is going to be wanting a card that's just good for a 3-color mana fixer. Pretty rare you're going to end up in 4 colors in the human module because all of these land cycles being 2-color lands typically means it's difficult to get the volume that you need to really fully play 4 colors. The low mana curve also contributes to that. If you're trying to go 1, 2, 3, it just makes sense, barring some historically powerful lands, again, fetch lands typically being a big part of it. You really want to keep things to 2 colors, maybe a splash, so that your mana will cooperate more often than not. So putting that all together, decks drafted in the human module, they tend to keep things to 2 colors, so maybe going into a third. You can be fully 3 colors if you get enough of the right mana fixing lands. Decks are typically going to play onto the battlefield, but there is some room to go into a more controlling deck. Blue, as I've described, it does have more non-creatures than creatures, so you can get some good card selection, some counter spells. Go into black or red, or maybe even white for some spot removal, figure out a small sampling of creatures that are maybe less reliant on synergies, or really lean into the synergies of the cube. Humans matter, sacrifice matter, get into any of these things that really compound with volume, and there's just not that much resistance once you decide your lane. If you want to be humans matter, you know that creatures are just going to work. If you want to be spells matter, Young Pyromancer is going to queue off of any instants and sorceries. It's largely a matter of figuring out your colors, and then the cube will empower you to do the things that you want to do, assuming that you are coloring within the lines, that you are trying to play these games on the battlefield, be it some creature deck, some control deck, even like a creature deck that has enough controlling elements. So you have some options on how you want to approach it, and then those options are really going to open up when we talk about drafting the modular cube environment. So the human module really does exist as a cube that has its own curated style of gameplay. This is something that's going to be, I think, pretty approachable, certainly in terms of cubes that have some pretty powerful stuff going on. The synergies are at least very vibes forward. I was talking about the history of Spooky Cube and the decision paralysis of drafters being a problem. It made the cube less approachable. It made people less interested in maybe drafting it a second time if their first draft was a train wreck. So adapting the human module and just getting these archetypes and this half of the cube just really forward. Okay, here, if you've played Magic, if you understand combat, really if you played almost any retail limited environment, there's stuff you can figure out here. The synergies aren't going to fight you. They're going to present yourself. If you want to play a Thalia's Lieutenant, it will not be difficult for you to figure out how to get some value out of Thalia's Lieutenant. And the cube does this while also still requiring skill to draft. I mean, that's the thing about Magic. There is always some skill that you're leveraging. There are so many different skills involved in Magic. Figuring out your colors, making sure you have the right mana fixing lands, that your deck can curve out the way that you intend it to, being able to tend to those sort of things are going to really reward you in this environment. So it's not just like, okay, it's the human modules, everything's human, it's really easy. It's approachable. The synergies are loud, apparent, you'll be able to do the things you want to do, but like every kind of magic, there is still skill expression. You're still going to be rewarded for navigating the draft better and understanding how to navigate those synergies, which of those synergies you want to explore, and drafting a deck that highlights the right things. And then when you want to get weird with it, the monster modules there, you can shuffle these up together and then get more of that classic Spooky Cube experience, enter that world of the humans versus the monsters. So the human module introduces you to this world inhabited largely by humans. They're hunters, gatherers. They have some problems. It's not necessarily clear. Like, you're rolling into town as kind of the aesthetic here, and maybe things seem a little off, but you can't place it. And there's these notes of stuff going to the graveyard at a faster rate, of discard mattering, and then the monster module will then show you the underbelly, what's really going on in the society, the things that go bump in the night, the things that these humans need to protect themselves from, the things that hunt these hunters. And we'll be back to talk about that more next week. So next week I will be going over that monster module, going over all of the graveyard matter stuff there and how that aspect of the design works, splitting the 360 card Spooky Cube into these two modular cube environments. Thank you so much for joining me this week. As always, I appreciate any likes, comments, shares, spreading the good word. If you enjoy the podcast, I greatly appreciate that. But even just taking the time to listen means a lot for me. So thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back next week talking more Cube, talking the monster module. Later, gamers.